Shaq was simply lending a helping hand when a rich woman's laughter echoed through the hotel lobby, sharp, mocking, and dripping with arrogance. "Look at this! A millionaire janitor!" she sneered. The room went silent. Guests stared. Cameras flashed. But instead of reacting with anger, Shaq just smiled, because he had a plan. What happened next shattered her world, exposed her darkest secrets, and turned humiliation into the ultimate lesson. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The laughter cut through the hotel lobby like a whip, sharp, cruel, dripping with arrogance. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from amusement. It was a laugh meant to humiliate. Shaq had heard that laugh before. He had heard it from men in suits who thought athletes were too dumb for business, from executives who assumed his wealth was just luck, from people who saw his size, his background, and thought they knew his worth. But the woman standing in front of him, she had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The five-star hotel lobby was a vision of luxury, gold chandeliers hanging from a high ceiling, polished marble floors gleaming under the warm glow of designer lighting. The air carried the scent of fresh espresso and expensive perfume. It was the kind of place where exclusivity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Shaq stood near the entrance, dressed in a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and limited edition sneakers. His presence was impossible to ignore, yet he carried himself with an effortless calm. Across the room, an elderly janitor struggled to lift a heavy trash bag into his cart. His back was slightly hunched, his frail arms straining as he attempted to heave it up. A few hotel guests noticed, but no one moved. Shaq moved. Without hesitation, he walked over and grabbed the bag with one hand, lifting it with ease and dropping it into the cart. The janitor looked up, startled. His eyes widened as he realized who had just helped him. That's when the laugh rang out. Veronica Hastings. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in an elegant white designer dress, her platinum blonde hair swept into a perfectly styled updo. A diamond bracelet shimmered on her wrist as she delicately held a champagne flute, her manicured nails tapping against the glass. She wasn't alone. A few wealthy guests stood nearby, watching with thinly veiled amusement. But Veronica? She was entertained. She let out another mocking chuckle, tilting her head slightly. "Oh, wow," she said, voice loud enough to carry across the lobby. "A millionaire janitor! How inspiring!" A few nervous chuckles followed, but the room had shifted. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. The janitor, who had looked grateful a moment ago, now stared at the floor, his face burning with humiliation. Shaq didn't react immediately. Instead, he placed his hands in his pockets and slowly turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes studying her like a puzzle he was in no rush to solve. Veronica raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a reaction. She smirked, swirling her champagne. Shaq finally spoke, his deep voice smooth, unshaken. "You sure you want to do this?" For the first time, Veronica's smirk faltered. A silence settled over the luxury hotel lobby. It wasn't the comfortable kind that came with prestige. It was the kind that carried tension, thick and suffocating. Veronica Hastings wasn't just mocking Shaq. She was performing. She wanted everyone to join in, to turn a simple act of kindness into something laughable, something beneath people like her. With a smug smile, she lifted her champagne flute and waved at a few wealthy guests lounging in the VIP area. Her voice, smooth and honeyed, carried across the room. "Tell me, should we all pitch in and get him a mop too?" A few guests chuckled, the type of forced laughter that comes when people don't want to be on the wrong side of the elite. Some looked away, sensing they were on dangerous ground. But one man, a businessman in a tailored navy suit, Rolex gleaming under the chandelier light, leaned forward with amusement. He smirked, shaking his head. Maybe he's practicing for his next job. More laughter, this time a little easier, a little more confident. Veronica's smirk widened. She took a slow sip of champagne, her eyes locked on Shaq like he was some kind of amusing spectacle. "Some people just don't belong in places like this." The words sliced through the air, cruel and deliberate. The elderly janitor, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. His grip tightened on the edge of his cart, his face turning red. He glanced at Shaq and mumbled, barely above a whisper, "Sir, you don't have to do this." Shaq hadn't moved, still holding the trash bag, still calm, unreadable. Then, without a word, he gently placed the bag back into the cart. His massive hand, the same hands that once held championship trophies, handled it with care, like it mattered. Then he turned back to Veronica. The smirk on her face didn't fade, but it faltered just a little. Shaq tilted his head, his deep voice smooth, controlled. "You talk a lot." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Let's see if you can back it up." For the first time, Veronica's posture stiffened. Shaq had dealt with people like Veronica Hastings before. People who believed that wealth made them invincible, that privilege was a permanent shield against consequences. He had seen their arrogance, their entitlement, their casual cruelty, and he had learned long ago that the best way to humble them wasn't through anger or words, it was through action. With an air of complete calm, he turned away from Veronica and made his way toward the VIP lounge, a secluded area at the far end of the luxury hotel lobby. The space was separated by a velvet rope, guarded by staff members who ensured that only the wealthiest, most exclusive clientele were allowed entry. Inside, guests reclined on plush leather seats, sipping from crystal glasses filled with the finest champagne. Conversations were hushed, the quiet confidence of people who had never been told no in their lives. As Shaq approached, all eyes turned to him. He didn't hesitate. He simply stepped over the velvet rope, found an empty chair, and sat down as if he belonged there, as if he owned the place. Veronica's reaction was immediate. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she stormed after him, her perfect posture stiff with irritation. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of superiority. "This lounge is for members only." She was expecting him to feel out of place, to flinch under the weight of her words. But Shaq merely leaned back, his massive frame making the luxurious armchair seem almost comically small beneath him. He rested one arm along the back, completely at ease, while his other hand casually pulled out his phone. Before he could speak, a nervous figure appeared beside them, the hotel manager. A middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit, he had clearly been summoned the moment Shaq had crossed into forbidden territory. His forehead was already glistening with sweat as he hesitated, caught between enforcing the rules and offending a celebrity of Shaq's stature. "Sir, I'm afraid this section is—" He trailed off, shifting his weight uncomfortably before stealing a glance at Veronica. It was obvious he was hoping Shaq would simply get up and walk away, saving everyone from the inevitable confrontation. But Shaq wasn't going anywhere. With the same steady calm, he tapped a few times on his phone and turned the screen toward the manager. "I was going to keep this quiet," he said, his voice smooth and composed, "but it looks like I just bought this hotel." The moment the words left his mouth, the entire room fell into a stunned silence. A few guests, mid-sip, lowered their glasses, their eyes widening as they looked between Shaq and the hotel manager. Someone at the bar let out a muffled cough, while another guest audibly sucked in a breath. The quiet murmur of conversations that had once filled the VIP lounge was now completely gone. Veronica's smirk disappeared so fast it was almost comical. The color drained from her face, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute until her knuckles turned white. For the first time, there was no mocking comment, no smug remark, just an expression of disbelief, as if she had just watched her entire world tilt on its axis. The hotel manager leaned forward, his eyes darting over the document on Shaq's screen. It was real. The deal had just been finalized. Shaquille O'Neal was now the majority shareholder of the very establishment Veronica believed she ruled. The manager straightened, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. He turned slightly toward Shaq, his voice suddenly far more careful. "Sir, what would you like us to do?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his deep-set eyes locked onto Veronica with quiet amusement. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I'd like to know more about our valued guests." Veronica gasped, her composure cracking for the first time. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she had no clever response. For years, Veronica Hastings walked through this hotel like she owned it. And why wouldn't she? She was a permanent fixture among the elite, a queen in a kingdom built for people like her. But at that moment, standing in front of Shaquille O'Neal, her world was shifting, fast. She let out a small, nervous laugh, tilting her head slightly as if she had just heard something ridiculous. "You're joking." Shaq didn't blink. Instead, he slid his phone across the table. the screen facing her. The document was clear as day. The EU, official purchase agreement, his name listed under majority shareholder. The ink on the deal still fresh. The air in the VIP lounge suddenly felt different. The quiet hum of conversation from the other wealthy guests turned into hushed whispers. Some were murmuring to each other, eyes darting between Shaq and Veronica. A few, the ones who had laughed along with her earlier, suddenly weren't so amused anymore. Someone even chuckled. Not at Shaq this time, but at her. Veronica's grip tightened around her champagne flute, her fingers pressing so hard into the delicate glass that for a moment it seemed like it might shatter. Her confidence faltered just for a split second. She turned to the hotel manager, expecting him to step in, to say something that would restore the natural order of things. But he was already standing straighter, his tone far more careful now. He cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, his voice directed at Shaq now, not her. "What would you like us to do?" Shaq leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes, dark, steady, locked onto Veronica like a hunter watching prey. "I'd like to know more," he said slowly, his deep voice smooth, deliberate. "About our valued guests." The color drained from Veronica's face. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The power that she had wielded so effortlessly just minutes ago, the effortless confidence, the dominance, was slipping away from her grasp like sand through her fingers. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "You," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she shook her head, forcing a smirk that no longer reached her eyes. "You wouldn't dare." Shaq raised an eyebrow. Wouldn't he? The tension in the VIP lounge had shifted completely. The whispers had turned to silent anticipation, the once smirking guests now watching with rapt attention. Shaq wasn't just looking for payback. He was looking for the truth. Still seated, he extended a hand without looking. His assistant, a sharp-dressed man with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, immediately placed a sleek black tablet into his palm. Shaq's fingers glided over the screen, the blue glow reflecting in his deep-set eyes. Background checks. Every high-profile guest in the hotel had one, stored neatly in the system, for security, for liability, and, as it turned out, for moments exactly like this. He scrolled, the smooth movement of his thumb the only sound in the suddenly too quiet room. Then he stopped. His posture didn't change. His expression remained calm, unreadable, but something in the air around him shifted. He slowly lifted his eyes from the screen, fixing them directly on Veronica Hastings. His voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth. Too smooth. "Now this is interesting." A muscle twitched in Veronica's jaw. She kept her back straight, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute, her nails pressing into the glass. She forced a laugh, a weak, hollow sound. "What?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, still trying to play the part of the untouchable elite. Shaq didn't answer right away. He simply kept looking at her, his dark eyes unreadable, the weight of his silence pressing down like a slow-building storm. Then he tapped the screen twice. The assistant took the tablet back, already knowing what to do. A second later, the screen at the front of the lounge, normally reserved for financial updates and stock market figures, flickered to life. Shaq leaned back, arms folded across his chest. "Let's take a look at who you really are, Veronica." The color drained from her face. Her posture, once perfectly poised and confident, suddenly stiffened. Her breath hitched for half a second. So subtle most wouldn't catch it, but Shaq did. She shifted in her seat, the first true sign of discomfort she had shown all night. And for the first time, she looked uneasy. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, pressing down on the lavish VIP lounge like an unseen force. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by an eerie, charged silence. The quiet clinking of glasses, the occasional rustle of silk against leather, the shifting of bodies leaning forward in anticipation, everything felt heightened. At the center of it all sat Veronica Hastings, the woman who had spent years commanding attention with ease. But at this moment, all eyes were on her for a very different reason. Shaq, still seated, leaned forward just slightly, his broad shoulders imposing even in his relaxed posture. His deep-set eyes remained locked on her, unwavering and sharp. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "Veronica Hastings." The way he said it made it clear. This wasn't just a question. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Veronica's fingers tensed around the delicate stem of her champagne flute, her nails pressing into the glass just enough that the pressure threatened to crack it. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same practiced, airy confidence she always used when dismissing people beneath her. She let out a soft chuckle, tilting her chin slightly. "Of course that's my name," she said, the words flowing smoothly, almost effortlessly. But there was something behind her eyes now, something uncertain, something calculating. Shaq, however, wasn't interested in the performance. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head, the motion deliberate. "Nah," he said, his tone measured, firm, leaving no room for argument. "Your real name is Vanessa Holloway, and you've been hiding something." The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the lounge shifted entirely. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the room, as if the very air had been sucked out. A few guests turned to each other, whispering in hushed, urgent tones. The hotel manager, standing near the entrance, exchanged a look with one of the senior staff members. Even the waitstaff, who had been expertly trained to ignore high society drama, couldn't help but pause mid-step, eyes flickering toward Veronica. The color drained from her face. It happened in an instant, a fleeting moment where her carefully crafted mask slipped. The slight widening of her eyes, the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the way her breath caught just briefly, tells that might have gone unnoticed in any other setting. But here, in a room filled with people waiting for a scandal to unfold, everyone saw it. She swallowed, her lips parting slightly before she caught herself. The moment of hesitation was almost imperceptible, but almost wasn't enough. Straightening her posture, she drew in a breath and tried again, forcing a small, tight smile. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice smooth, but just a little too careful now. Shaq's lips curled into a smirk, the kind that said he wasn't just winning, he had already won. The weight of Shaq's words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on Veronica Hastings like an avalanche. Moments ago, she had been untouchable, the queen of this world, dripping in wealth, power, and privilege. Now the very foundation she had built her life upon was beginning to crack. She forced a smile, though it lacked the confidence she had carried all night. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said again, her voice carefully measured, but the slight tremor in her tone betrayed her. Shaq didn't blink, didn't even flinch. Instead, he lifted the tablet in his hand and began to read aloud, his voice calm, steady, and devastating. Fraud, identity theft, deception. The room, already charged with tension, grew impossibly still. A few guests turned to each other, whispering in hushed tones. Others leaned in, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to something far more entertained, intrigued, hungry. Veronica stiffened, her fingers digging into the fabric of her designer dress. Her entire life had been built on reputation, the illusion of prestige, the appearance of wealth, the belief that she belonged among the elite. And now in real time, she could feel the illusion unraveling. Shaq scrolled further, his expression unreadable as he scanned the information. Then he let out a small chuckle. "You know," he said, almost amused, "I was expecting a few speeding tickets, maybe some unpaid taxes. But this?" He shook his head and looked up. "This is a whole new level of fake." Veronica's breathing hitched. She sat up straighter, her posture tense, her pulse hammering beneath the diamonds on her wrist. "I don't know what kind of lies you think you've uncovered," she spat, her voice sharp, defensive, desperate. "But I'd be careful about throwing around baseless accusations." Shaq let out a slow exhale, tilting his head slightly, studying her. Then he turned the tablet around. "You have no proof?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I own this hotel. Want to guess what I found in your records?" For the first time, Veronica looked genuinely afraid. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The walls were closing in. The hotel guests weren't whispering anymore. They were openly staring, their curiosity turning to fascination, to amusement, to quiet, cruel delight. And then a voice cut through the room. "Sir?" Shaq looked up as two uniformed security guards stepped forward. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at Veronica. The color drained from her face. Her fingers clenched into fists, and for the first time all night, she started shaking. For the first time in her life, Veronica Hastings had no escape. She had always been the kind of woman who knew how to turn a situation in her favor. If she made a mistake, she had the money to cover it up. If she stepped on the wrong toes, she had the connections to smooth things over. And if all else failed, She could charm, manipulate, or buy her way out of any trouble. But this was different. The weight of Shaq's gaze was steady, unshaken by the performance she had spent her whole life perfecting. Around them, the room remained silent, yet the air was thick with unspoken judgment. The very people who had once laughed at her jokes, sipped champagne by her side, and treated her as one of their own were now watching her with barely contained amusement. Their expressions had shifted, not with concern, not with sympathy, but with something colder, more detached. They weren't looking at Veronica Hastings, the elite socialite. They were looking at a woman crumbling under the weight of her own lies. She felt the shift, felt the power that had always surrounded her slipping through her fingers. Her carefully crafted image was breaking apart piece by piece, and if she didn't do something, anything, she would be left with nothing. She took a slow breath, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think we've had a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the smooth, practiced charm she had spent years perfecting. She took a step forward, ignoring the two security guards standing just a few feet away, their presence a quiet reminder that her time was running out. "Whatever it is you think you found, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." Shaq didn't respond right away. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, arms folded across his broad chest, his expression unreadable. Veronica's fingers twitched. She needed him to say something, anything. "I can pay you," she added quickly, seizing the moment before it slipped through her grasp. Her chin lifted slightly, her confidence faltering, but not yet gone. "Whatever you want, name your price." Shaq exhaled, the sound slow and deliberate. Then, without breaking eye contact, he shook his head. "It ain't about money." The words hit harder than she expected. For the first time, she realized that her wealth meant nothing here. The cold sting of panic crept up her spine as the weight of those 5 words settled in. She had no leverage, no power, nothing to bargain with. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the once welcoming chandeliers now casting a harsh, unforgiving light over her. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred at the edges. She couldn't lose everything. Not like this. Her knees felt weak, and then, without thinking, she dropped. A collective gasp rippled through the lounge. The woman who had once looked down on everyone from her self-made pedestal, who had treated people as disposable, was now kneeling on the cold marble floor. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together, her voice barely a whisper at first. "Please," she said, desperation cracking through the carefully curated elegance of her tone. "Please, don't ruin me." Shaq's expression remained impassive. He studied her for a moment, his silence stretching longer than she could bear. Then finally he spoke, his voice calm, steady, and final. "You did that yourself." The sound of high heels scraping against marble filled the air, a desperate attempt to keep footing on ground that was no longer hers to stand on. Moments ago, Veronica Hastings sat atop her throne, untouchable, revered, feared. Now she was on her knees, stripped of the power she had wielded so carelessly. Shaq, towering over her, watched in silence, his expression unreadable. He had seen men break under pressure, had watched arrogance crumble when faced with undeniable truth. But this was something else entirely. Veronica's breathing was uneven, her shoulders rising and falling as panic settled deep into her bones. The whispers around her weren't whispers anymore. They were chuckles, muffled laughter, the sound of the elite turning on one of their own. She had been their queen. Now, she was entertainment. Shaq exhaled slowly, then turned to the hotel manager standing nearby. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of finality. "Escort Miss Hastings out." For a second, nobody moved. The order, so simple, yet so devastating, hung in the air like a death sentence. Then the security guard stepped forward. Veronica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Wait," she started, her voice high and panicked. You can't. You wouldn't dare." Shaq didn't react, didn't even blink. One of the guards reached for her arm. She yanked it back. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked, her voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled. She looked around wildly, her gaze darting to the other guests. "Are you all just going to stand there? Do something." But nobody moved. Not one of them reached out to help her. Phones, however, were lifted. Screens glowed as guests recorded every humiliating second, capturing the downfall of the woman who had once ruled this place. The realization dawned on her, slow and cruel. Nobody was coming to save her. Her breathing turned ragged as she stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of the carpet. The security guards flanked her now, one at each side, blocking any chance of escape. "Wait, please!" She tried again, her voice cracking. She turned back to Shaq, her once cunning eyes now clouded with desperation. "I can fix this. Just, just tell me what you want. I'll do anything." Shaq simply shook his head. "Not my problem." Her lips parted, but before she could plead again, the guards took her by the arms. "No!" she screamed, thrashing as they pulled her toward the exit. The onlookers watched, some whispering, some smirking, all knowing that this was a moment they wouldn't forget. As she was dragged through the Grand Hotel lobby, her voice cut through the air one last time, raw and filled with venom. "This isn't over," she shrieked. "Do you hear me, Shaq? This isn't over." Shaq didn't respond. He just watched as the doors shut behind her. The fall of Veronica Hastings should have ended the moment she was dragged out of the hotel, her reputation shattered beyond repair. But karma wasn't finished with her yet. The moment her screams echoed through the lobby doors, cameras outside snapped to attention. Reporters who had initially gathered for an unrelated event were suddenly bombarded with the scene of the century. A woman in a designer dress, her makeup streaked, her carefully composed life coming apart at the seams. Someone in the crowd recognized her instantly. "Wait, isn't that Veronica Hastings?" Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded, and hashtags like #Veronica exposed and #Shaq strikes back began trending worldwide. But that was only the beginning. As the video circulated, the world started asking questions. Who was Veronica Hastings really? How did she become one of the elite so quickly? And more importantly, what was she hiding? It didn't take long to find out. Reporters dug into her past, peeling back the layers of the life she had built on deception. And the deeper they went, the worse it got. Fraud, identity theft, forged documents, stolen investments. Every article revealed a new scandal. Every investigative piece pulled back another ugly truth. Turns out, Veronica Hastings wasn't just a socialite. She was a con artist. She had spent years manipulating wealthy investors, promising them high returns through exclusive business ventures that never actually existed. She had pocketed millions, laundering the money through shell companies, using it to buy her way into high society. But with her name now plastered across headlines for all the wrong reasons, those investors were coming back to collect, and the law was right behind them. The financial authorities wasted no time freezing her assets. The accounts she once used so freely, the credit cards she swiped without a second thought, all of it was locked down, inaccessible. She tried to fight it, of course, hired the best lawyers money could buy. But there was one problem. She no longer had the money. Her expensive penthouse? Seized. Her luxury cars? Repossessed. Her designer jewelry? Her art collection? Even the furniture she once bragged about? Gone. She watched in horror as her empire crumbled faster than she had ever built it. The people she had once surrounded herself with, businessmen, investors, high society friends, were now ghosting her calls. She had spent her entire life clawing her way to the top, stepping on anyone who got in her way. And now there was no one left to catch her. The final blow came when a warrant for her arrest was issued. The authorities wanted answers, and they wanted them now. But Veronica Hastings had one last move left. She ran. One night, while the world continued to feast on the remains of her once glamorous life, she slipped away. No farewell, no last words. She vanished. No one knew where she went. No one really cared. She was just another disgraced fraudster, another cautionary tale. She had once ruled the social elite. Now she was nothing. And just like that, Veronica Hastings was forgotten. Veronica Hastings was gone, erased from the world she once controlled. No more lavish parties, no more designer dresses, no more power. She had disappeared into obscurity, but Shaq wasn't focused on her downfall. He was focused on what came next. Because true success isn't just about proving people wrong, it's about building something that lasts. The hotel where it all began now had a new story to tell. Instead of being a place for the arrogant and entitled to flaunt their wealth, it became a beacon of opportunity. Shaq, without hesitation, donated a massive sum of money to fund scholarships for janitors and their families. The people who had spent years being overlooked, the workers who made luxury possible but were never acknowledged, they were finally being given a chance to rise. One of the first recipients of the program? The elderly janitor Shaq had helped that day in the lobby. His name was Carlos Ramirez, a man who had worked tirelessly for decades, cleaning up after people who never once thought to learn his name, until now. With Shaq's support, Carlos wasn't just another worker anymore. He was promoted to manager, overseeing the very team he had once been a part of. No longer invisible, no longer struggling to get by, he was finally being recognized for the value he had always brought. The media caught wind of Shaq's initiative, and soon the story spread like wildfire. One journalist, standing outside the hotel where it had all begun, spoke to the cameras. A year ago, this was the site of one of the most humiliating scandals in high society. Veronica Hastings, a woman who once mocked others for their place in life, was exposed as a fraud and vanished into obscurity. But today, this hotel represents something else entirely. Thanks to Shaquille O'Neal's generosity, dozens of janitors and their families will now have access to higher education, career training, and opportunities they were once denied. The cameras cut to Shaq, standing near the entrance of the hotel, calm, collected, and completely unbothered by the chaos of the past. A journalist stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Shaq, you've built something incredible out of all of this. Any final words for Veronica Hastings?" Shaq didn't hesitate. He just smiled, slow and knowing. "Hope she learned something." A full year had passed since Veronica Hastings vanished from the world she once controlled. The headlines that had once been plastered with her name, dripping in scandal and disgrace, had long since faded. The media had moved on to fresher stories, new controversies, and the latest socialite drama. Her former friends, the high society elites who once clinked glasses with her at extravagant galas, had erased her from their memories. In their world, she had never existed. But time had not been kind to Veronica. It was a quiet afternoon in an upscale shopping district. The air smelled of polished leather and expensive cologne, and soft classical music played in the background. Shaq had stopped by after a business meeting, his towering frame effortlessly commanding attention as he browsed through a selection of luxury watches. His success had only grown over the past year, his empire expanding, his influence deepening. He had not spared a single thought for Veronica Hastings, until now. As he approached the cashier's counter, something familiar caught his eye. A posture that was once proud, but now slightly hunched. A face that had once been the epitome of confidence, but now carried the weight of quiet exhaustion. It was her, Veronica Hastings, though she was no longer Veronica Hastings. She stood behind the counter, her long manicured nails now trimmed short, her designer wardrobe replaced by a dull gray store-issued uniform. A name tag clipped carelessly onto her chest, read Vanessa H. For a brief moment, Shaq simply watched. She was assisting a difficult customer, her expression carefully composed as she nodded along to a string of complaints. Her lips stretched into a polite, professional smile, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Defeat. Once, she had owned entire rooms with her presence. Once, she had laughed at those she deemed beneath her. Now she was standing in a position she had never imagined for herself, a place she had mocked others for occupying, and she had no idea Shaq was standing just a few feet away. He could have said something, a greeting, a reminder, a small acknowledgement of who she had been and what she had lost. He could have even offered some final lesson, a parting remark that would leave her haunted for years to come, but there was no need. Veronica's reality was punishment enough. Shaq exhaled quietly, shook his head, and turned toward the exit. And just before he stepped outside, he let out a deep, amused chuckle, low, knowing, and undeniable. The last laugh was his,